Alrighty, room 308. It is Friday morning, our last installment of Harry Potter for this week. We left off with Ron's family. Harry's there, and Ron has to go denome the garden because he got in trouble, and I believe his brothers do too. Harry looked at the cover of Mrs. Weasley's book. Written across it in fancy gold letters were the words, Gilderoy Lockhart's Guide to Household Pests. There was a big photograph on the front of a very good-looking wizard with wavy blonde hair and bright blue eyes. As always in the wizarding world, the photograph was moving. The wizard, who Harry supposed was Gilderoy Lockhart, kept winking cheekily up at them all. Mrs. Weasley beamed down at him. "Oh, he is marvelous," she said. "He knows his household pests all right. It's a wonderful book." "Mum fancies him," said Fred in a very audible whisper. "Don't be so ridiculous, Fred," said Mrs. Weasley, her cheeks rather pink. "All right, well, if you think you know better than Lockhart, you can go and get on with it, and woe betide you if there's a single gnome left in that garden when I come out to inspect it." Yawning and grumbling, the Weasleys slouched outside with Harry behind them. The garden was large and, in Harry's eyes, exactly what a garden should be. The Dursleys would not have liked it. There were plenty of weeds, and the grass needed cutting, but there were gnarled trees all around the walls. Plants Harry had never seen spilling from every flower bed, and a big green pond full of frogs. "Muggles have garden gnomes too, you know," Harry told Ron as they crossed the lawn. "Yeah, I've seen those things that they think are gnomes," said Ron, bent double with his head in a peony bush. "Like fat little Father Christmases with fishing rods." There was a violent scuffling noise, the peony bush shuddered, and Ron straightened up. "This is a gnome," he said grimly. "Get off me!" squealed the gnome. It was certainly nothing like Father Christmas. It was a small, leathery-looking, with a large, knobbly, bald head, exactly like a potato. Ron held it at arm's length as it kicked out at him with its horny little feet. He grasped it around the ankles and turned it upside down. "This is what you have to do," he said. He raised the gnome above his head. "Get off me!" and started to swing it in great circles like a lasso. Seeing the shocked look on Harry's face, Ron added, "It doesn't hurt them. You've just got to make them really dizzy so they can't find their way back to their gnome holes." He let go of the gnome's ankles. It flew 20 feet in the air and landed with a thud in the field over the hedge. "Pitiful," said Fred. "I bet mine can get beyond that stump." Harry learned quickly not to feel sorry for the gnomes. He decided just to drop the first one he caught. He decided just to drop the first one he caught over the hedge. But the gnome, sensing his weakness, sank its razor-sharp teeth into Harry's finger, and he had a hard job shaking it off until... Wow! Harry, that must have been 50 feet! The air was soon thick with flying gnomes. "See, they're not too bright," said George. Let's see if I can angle this so you guys can see the page. "The moment they know the denoming's going on, they storm up and have a look. You'd think that they'd have learned by now just to stay put." Soon, the crowd of gnomes in the field started walking away in a staggering line, with their little shoulders hunched. "They'll be back," said Ron, as they watched the gnomes disappear into the hedge on the other side of the field. "They love it here. Dad's too soft with them. He thinks they're funny." Just then, the front door slammed. "He's back," said George. "Dad's home." They hurried through the garden and back into the house. Mr. Weasley was slumped into a kitchen chair with his glasses off and his eyes closed. He was a thin man and going bald, but the little hair he had was as red as any of his children's. He was wearing long green robes which were dusty and travel-worn. "What a night," he mumbled, groping for the teapot as they all sat down around him. 9 raids! 9! And Mundungus Fletcher tried to put a hex on me when I had my back turned. Mr. Weasley took a long gulp of tea and sighed. "Find anything, Dad?" said Fred eagerly. "All I got were a few shrinking door keys and a biting kettle," yawned Mr. Weasley. "There was some pretty nasty stuff that wasn't from my department, though. Mortlake was taken away for questioning about some extremely odd ferrets, but that's the Committee on Experimental Charms, thank goodness." "Why would anybody bother making doorknobs shrink?" said George. "Just muggle baiting," sighed Mr. Weasley. "Sell them a key that keeps shrinking into nothing, and they can never find it when they need it. Of course, it's very hard to convict anyone because no muggle would admit that their keys keep shrinking. They'll insist they just keep losing it. Bless them, they'll go to any length to ignore magic, even if it's staring them right in the face. But the things our lot have taken to enchanting, you wouldn't believe." "Like cars, for instance?" Mrs. Weasley had appeared, holding a long poker like a sword. Mr. Weasley's eyes jerked open. He stared guiltily at his wife. "Cars, Molly dear?" "Yes, Arthur, cars," said Mrs. Weasley, her eyes flashing. "Imagine a wizard buying a rusty old car and telling his wife that all he wanted to do with it was take it apart and see how it worked, while really he was enchanting it to make it fly." Mr. Weasley blinked. "Well, dear, I think you'll find that he would be quite within the law to do that, if, maybe he would have done better to, tell his wife the truth. You know, there's a loophole in the law you'll find as long as he wasn't intending to fly the car, the fact that he could fly it wouldn't—" "Arthur Weasley, you made sure there was a loophole when you wrote that law," shouted Mrs. Weasley, "just so you could carry on tinkering with all that muggle rubbish in your shed. And for your information, Harry arrived this morning in the car that you weren't intending to fly." "Harry?" said Mr. Weasley blankly. "Harry who?" He looked around, saw Harry, and jumped. "Good Lord, is it Harry Potter? Very pleased to meet you. Ron's told us so much about—" "Your sons flew that car to Harry's house and back last night," shouted Mrs. Weasley. "What have you got to say about that, huh?" "Did you really?" said Mr. Weasley eagerly. "Did it go all right? I mean—" He faltered as sparks flew from Mrs. Weasley's eyes. "That was very wrong, boys. Very wrong indeed." "Let's leave them to it," muttered Ron to Harry as Mrs. Weasley swelled like a bullfrog. "Come on, I'll show you my bedroom." They slipped out of the kitchen and down the narrow passageway to an uneven staircase, which zigzagged its way up through the house. On the third landing, a door stood ajar. Harry just caught sight of a pair of bright brown eyes staring at him before it closed with a snap. "Ginny," said Ron, "you don't know how weird it is for her to be this shy. She never shuts up normally." They climbed 2 more flights until they reached a door with peeling paint and a small plaque on it saying, "Ronald's room." Harry stepped in with his head almost touching the sloping ceiling and blinked. It was like walking into a furnace. Nearly everything in Ron's room seemed to be a violent shade of orange. The bedspread, the walls, even the ceiling. Then Harry realized that Ron had covered nearly every inch of the shabby wallpaper with posters of the same 7 witches and wizards, all wearing bright orange robes, carrying broomsticks, and waving energetically. "Your Quidditch team?" asked Harry. "The Chudley Cannons," said Ron, pointing at the orange bedspread, which was emblazoned with 2 giant black C's and a speeding cannonball. 9th in the league. Ron's school spellbooks were stacked untidily in a corner next to a pile of comics, which all seemed to feature the adventures of Martin Miggs, the Mad Muggle. Ron's magic wand was lying on top of a fish tank full of frog spawn on the windowsill, next to his fat gray rat, Scabbers, who was snoozing in a patch of sun. Harry stepped over a pack of self-shuffling playing cards on the floor and looked out at the tiny window. In a field far below, he could see a gang of gnomes sneaking, one by one, back through the Weasleys' hedge. Then he turned to look at Ron, who was watching him, almost nervously, as though to wait for an opinion. "It's a bit small," said Ron quickly. "Not like that room you had with the Muggles, and I'm right underneath the ghoul in the attic, and he's always banging on the pipes and groaning." But Harry, grinning widely, said, "This is the best house I've ever been in." Ron's ears went pink. So I want you to try to think here, using your inferencing skills. What do you think that Ron was feeling when he was trying to explain, like, oh, well, the room's kind of small, and kind of explaining things away? How do you think Ron might have been feeling? And what might he have been kind of nervous about? And I also want you to think about how Harry was feeling, and how Ron's feelings might have changed when Harry told him this is the best house I've ever been in. Alrighty, we do have some time to start Chapter 4. It's called At Flourish and Blots, and we've got one picture to start with. Life at the Burrow was as different as possible from life in Privet Drive. The Dursleys liked everything neat and ordered. The Weasleys' house burst with the strange and unexpected. Harry got a shock the first time he looked in the mirror over the kitchen mantelpiece and shouted, "Tuck your shirt in, Scruffy!" The ghoul in the attic howled and dropped pipes whenever he felt things were getting too quiet, and small explosions from Fred and George's bedroom were considered perfectly normal. What Harry found most unusual about life at Ron's, however, wasn't the talking mirror or the clanking ghoul. It was the fact that everybody there seemed to like him. Mrs. Weasley fussed over the state of his socks and tried to force him to eat 4th helpings at every meal. Mr. Weasley liked Harry to sit next to him at the dinner table so that he could bombard him with questions about life with the Muggles, asking him to explain how things like plugs and the postal service worked. "Fascinating," he would say, as Harry talked him through using a telephone. "Ingenious, really! How many ways Muggles have found about getting along without magic!" Harry heard from Hogwarts one sunny morning, about a week after he arrived at the Burrow. He and Ron went down to breakfast to find Mr. and Mrs. Weasley and Ginny already sitting at the kitchen table. The moment she saw Harry, Ginny accidentally knocked her porridge bowl to the floor with a loud clatter. Ginny seemed very prone to knocking things over whenever Harry entered a room. She dived under the table to retrieve the bowl and emerged with her face glowing like the setting sun. Pretending he hadn't noticed this, Harry sat down and took the toast that Mrs. Weasley offered him. What can we infer that Ginny's feeling? I know you can't answer it, but you can think it. "Letters from school," said Mrs. Weasley, passing Harry and Ron identical envelopes of yellowish parchment addressed in green ink. "Dumbledore already knows you're here, Harry. Doesn't miss a trick, that man. You've got them. You two've got them, too," she added, as Fred and George ambled in, still in their pajamas. For a few minutes there was silence as they all read their letters. Harry's told him to catch the Hogwarts Express as usual from King's Cross Station on September the 1st. There were also a list of new books that he would need for the coming year. Second-year students will require The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2, by Miranda Goshawk. Break with a Banshee, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Gadding with Ghouls, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Holidays with Hags, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Travels with Trolls, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Voyages with Vampires, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Wanderings with Werewolves, by Gilderoy Lockhart. And Gear with the Yeti, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Fred, who had finished his own list, peered over at Harry's. "You've been told to get all Lockhart's books, too," he said. "The new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher must be a fan. Bet it's a witch." At this point, Fred caught his mother's eye and quickly busied himself with the marmalade. "That lot won't come cheap," said George, with a quick look at his parents. "Lockhart's books are really expensive." "Well, we'll manage," said Mrs. Weasley, but she looked worried. "I expect we'll be able to pick up a lot of Ginny's things second-hand." "Oh, are you starting at Hogwarts this year?" Harry asked Ginny. She nodded, blushing to the roots of her flaming hair, and put her elbow in the butter dish. Fortunately, no one saw this except Harry, because just then Ron's elder brother Percy walked in. He was already dressed, with his Hogwarts prefect badge pinned to his knitted tank top. "Morning, all," said Percy briskly. "Lovely day." He sat down in the only remaining chair, but leapt up again almost immediately, pulling from underneath him a molten gray feather duster. At least, that's what Harry thought it was, until he saw that it was breathing. "Errol!" said Ron, taking a limp owl from Percy and extracting a letter from under its wing. "Finally! He's got Hermione's answer. I wrote to her saying that you were going to try and rescue you from the Dursleys." He carried Errol up to a perch, just inside the door, and tried to stand him on it, but Errol flopped straight off again, so Ron laid him out on the draining board instead. Poor Errol. Muttering, "Pathetic." Then he ripped open Hermione's letter and read it out loud. "Dear Ron, and Harry, if you're there, I hope everything went all right and that Harry is okay and that you didn't do anything illegal to get him out, Ron, because that would get Harry into trouble too. I've been really worried, and if Harry's all right, will you please let me know at once, but perhaps it would be better if you used a different owl, because I think another delivery might finish your owl off. I'm very busy with schoolwork, of course." "How could she be busy?" said Ron. "We're on holiday." "And we're going to London next Wednesday to buy my new books. Why don't we meet in Diagon Alley? Let me know what's happening as soon as you can. Love, from Hermione." "Well, that fits in nicely. We can all go get your things then, too," said Mrs. Weasley, starting to clear the table. "What are you all up to today?" Harry, Ron, and Fred, and George were planning to go up the hill to a small paddock that the Weasleys owned. It was surrounded by trees that blocked it from view in the village below, meaning that they could practice Quidditch there as long as they didn't fly too high. They couldn't use real Quidditch balls, which would have been hard to explain if they had escaped or flown away over the village. Instead, they threw apples for each other to catch. They took it in turns to ride Harry's Nimbus 2000, which was easily the best broom. Ron's old shooting star was often outstripped by passing butterflies. 5 minutes later, they were marching up the hill, broomsticks over their shoulders. They had asked Percy if he wanted to join them, but he had said he was too busy. Harry had only seen Percy at mealtime so far. He stayed shut in his room the rest of the time. Alright, we have to kind of abruptly stop there because I realize that we're getting very close to the 20-minute mark, which means this would be a long upload. Alrighty, I hope that you all have a wonderful weekend. I hope everyone's staying safe and staying healthy and happy, and I loved getting to Zoom with you guys this week and can't wait to do that again next week. So let's see. I want you to think about this weekend and be prepared to share when we next meet 3 things that you have found a new appreciation for, things that you feel newly grateful for. For example, I have a new appreciation for puzzles and Scrabble. Jackson and I have been spending a lot of time sitting here just working on a puzzle, taking our time, and doing things slowly. So that's my new appreciation. All right, love you guys. Have a good weekend.